The Talk, episode 304, featuring Diana Keough. Welcome to Be The Talk. We go behind the talk 7 days a week for tips and techniques to help you change the world. I'm Nathan Eckel, and a talker myself. I'm interviewing others who change the world with their talk. You can too, even if you've never given a talk before. Let's get started with today's show. We are live with Diana Keough. Diana, are you ready to talk?
We are ready to talk. Good morning, Nathan. How are you?
Diana Keough is a Pulitzer-prize nominated journalist whose byline appeared regularly in The Plain Dealer, National Public Radio, PBS, and she is also an entrepreneur who successfully launched and then exited a digital creative services agency that started as a side project. Diana Keough, welcome to the talk.
Great to be here.
Your talk is called The Power of Personal Stories. Oh, my word. Powerful talk, because you came from a very kind of strict, maybe well-meaning environment and background, but 20, 30 years later, you found out tragically your father was living a double life. Your parents were both infected with AIDS in, it sounded like the late 80s, when the stigma was as at historic proportions. And through it all, you learned that there was a really important part of you that needed to be told, and you found a way to be able to share your story. So there's an awful lot there. Please take us behind the talk.
Well, I mean, just saying that I had two parents that died of AIDS, I'm sure that everybody's like, wait, what? So January 7th, 1988, I found out that my dad had been diagnosed with the AIDS virus. The doctors think that they were probably he was probably infected 10 years before. And this is, the 80s, late 80s. And as you said, it was the stigma, the horror, the kind of let's shove this under the rug, and it's only homosexual and it's only drug abusers and they're getting what they deserve, right? And I was my father was a senior law partner in Milwaukee. They had been church planters, and it would be like you or most of the listeners finding out that their father was leading a double life, right? It was that shocking. And then 3 weeks later, because the test took that long, we found out that my mom was also infected. Now, I'm one of 6 children. I'm number 5 in that birth order. And all of us were as shocked as anybody could be. We became almost piranhas or lepers in the little town that we were in outside the city of Milwaukee. My parents were church planters, so there were a number of churches that they had been part of starting in our living room, and my dad would lead those services, and then we'd go and financially help a building be built, and then we would go on and plant another church. So I grew up very fundamentalist. I was baptized in the Episcopal Church. We left that church to start another one. Then I was basically walked down the aisles in a couple Baptist churches, and I walked down the aisles in a couple non-denominational churches. But it was the shock, right? So we had to move my dad out of town, and change his name because we were being blackmailed by former lovers. And we moved my mom to the other side of Milwaukee, and Milwaukee is a little bit, of a town that the East and the West, just like Cleveland, ironically enough, they don't actually mix very well or mix at all. And so for us, it was a level of safety that the communities were so separate that we moved my mom over from the west side to the east side of Milwaukee. And so, a lot of what happened is we were living in California at the time, and my first son, I have 4 sons, and my first son was about 6 months old when this diagnosis had happened. And what made it a little bit harder, is that my mom and I had never really gotten along well. In fact, we had gone years throughout different periods of my life without speaking. I mean, years. I went to a college that she didn't approve of, and she stopped speaking to me for most of the time I was there. I took a job after college that she didn't approve of, and so she didn't speak to me or help me plan my wedding. So my period, I was actually living in California, and I was coming home for Christmas for the first time in 3 years. And when all of this diagnosis happened. But in California, I would share with people that I had gotten to know, or friends that I consider very close friends, what was going on. And it was either a deer in the headlights, or they would come into my home at another time and not eat or touch or drink. They would, I'd offer them something to drink, or they would come over for dinner and they would just push food around because everyone was afraid of getting it.
Yeah.
Because
people we had no awareness. And I'm just going to offer a couple of things. Now, I've mentioned already today in other interviews, I mean, I come from a very healthcare family. So I remember being in junior high school-ish time when this was all going out, hearing debates, and actually similar to you, Diana, I come from a faith background, which is not always perfect and obviously very imperfect at times. And so, so many ways that I'm really appreciating what you're saying here. But the stigma was absolutely huge. It was huge in the public. It was huge in the media. It was huge even in the medical community, and they're debating what's going on. And these are the most highly educated medical people out there. So, I mean, Diana, the story is on, we're going to have a link to that, and there's going to be all kinds of, opportunities for people to watch the story and get to the bottom of everything that you were able to endure. I think the biggest takeaway for me was for other people of faith or any kind of belief system, but especially if people coming from more of a traditional background, what really struck me about your talk is that the redemption of it, the amazing story arc. So you got to watch this talk and see how it gets, more twists and turns to come around. But I really appreciated how you were able to be so authentic, so vulnerable, so transparent, and yet, and not to, make a judgment on your personal belief system right now, but you were able to honor kind of the beliefs that you had without just dismissing the whole thing. And the reason I mention that is because I think there are a lot of people that like TED Talks and they come from maybe more traditional backgrounds, but a lot of times there's maybe a throwing under the bus or whatever. You didn't do that. You really honored the spirit of the entire thing. So I know this is a little bit of a dramatic pivot. I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, and that's an interesting take on the talk, because there was a period of time that I actually did tell God, I don't believe you anymore. And if my dad could be such a liar, because he of my parents was the kind one. So what I didn't mention up front is all six of us basically blamed my mom for him going off into having these secret lovers and having the secret life, because she was so difficult to live with, which is, as a wife and a mother now, is just mortifying to me, right? That and understanding how things can be misperceived by your children. But imagine being married for as long as they are and never knowing that side of your husband, how lonely that could be, right? And he was, affidavit. People came to the door and claimed, "Hey, you're having an affair with your husband." Like a man would come to the door, and my dad, as a lawyer, would actually then get an affidavit saying, "Listen, he's a liar, and he's just wanting to, he did blah 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 blah." There's always excuses, right? So I think for me, I did walk away from my faith for a little bit. I mean, I was walking down the church. I still wanted my kids to go, but I would be walking down whatever church we were attending and looking at everybody up on stage or in the pews going, "Hypocrite, hypocrite, hypocrite, hypocrite," without knowing that we're all hypocrites, right? So, but I just assumed that everybody was doing that, right? And so, the trust issues became a huge issue. But as I talk about in my story, in the TED Talk, is that even though I told God I didn't believe him because he must have been a cosmic joke, when you tell God that you don't believe him and that you're going to have to prove yourself to me, it's like the prodigal son. It's like he was always waiting. The father was always waiting in the driveway, waiting in eager anticipation for the son to come home. But what happened is, as part of the talk, I was invited to prison, and, there's a whole narrative arc here where my mom, as difficult as she was, and it was still making us cry, we couldn't speak about my father in front of her. But, for some reason, I pursued her as a journalist, and I pursued my father as and with an arm's length, like I was interviewing them both. And that's how I handled this whole thing.
Wow.
Because I just had hours and hours and hours of tape, and that's how I could manage.
So you almost externalized
Absolutely.
And use that mechanism of journalism and interview, kind of like somebody that I know that interviews a lot of people.
Right.
You can go into interview mode. I'm in interview mode right now, and what a great device to be able to to get to the bottom.
And when that you're in that mode, it's not about you. So you basically are asking the questions and getting the answers without an emotional attachment, right? So the best stories, as you know, Nathan, are the ones that you actually do feel something, right? And I'm often asked, it's like, especially since I've made a career out of telling a lot of these types of stories, how do you not get so sad? It's because, again, it's not about me, right? And if you tell the story with a redemptive point of view, and there's always redemption. There is always redemption, right? Otherwise they're not ready to tell their story, for example. But that's a whole nother Be the Talk we could do, right?
Well, it certainly is. And I've got to mention right now, Diana, I think maybe we record a different segment for all of the other accomplishments that you've had. You've been teaching at Emory University. You're Pulitzer-prize nominated. You've done all of these things. You set up a side business that then got purchased and spun off. And you're doing all kinds of different enterprises. And that's the power of realizing that you have a story, you can share your story, and it's a really powerful thing to be able to do that. And I'd love for you to just speak to the power of this vehicle of TED Talks, TEDx Talks, because I just love it when I find people who have a real, everyone that I interview has a belief system. They all have an authentic, I would call it an authentic faith of some sort. They have a belief system. And it's very interesting to me to see other people that kind of come from a similar environment that I do, that tell an authentic story using this vehicle in an inclusive way so that everybody relates. And it's not, it's not anything other than sharing your story. What have you found? What advice do you have to other people that want to share their authentic story on this vehicle? And maybe they're coming from a more traditional background that is, a little bit played out in other circles. What can they do to give a good talk?
Well, I think it comes back to, I didn't make the story structure up, right? Joseph Conrad kind of put it on the map. But if you look back on all the great, like a Viktor Frankl story, The Man's Search for Meaning, who talks about the meaning of suffering only finds meaning when you find that meaning. And I did a very poor paraphrase on that, but everyone has a story. But what makes a story is if you find the so what of that story, right? So what did I learn? What are the mistakes I made? What are the lessons I learned? What, if I could do it all over again, what would I do differently? And if you look at the stories that we love, and what do they say? There's really only 4 basic story types in the world, and everything else kind of comes in that. But in the TED Talk, the ones that we are really engaged in, there's a narrative arc. So here's the situation that happened, here's the conflict, and here's the arc, right? And every TED Talk, or even every story that I tell, has that same narrative arc where the conflict and then the hero, or the hero is the guide. And if you look at the way that I set up the TED Talk, the guide comes in with a Carla Faye Tucker, right? With those of you that have not seen that, Carla Faye Tucker was a death row inmate that I was invited to go meet, that my mom had been spending a lot of time with, that basically she changed, just like it was a locomotive going 100 miles an hour that slammed into reverse. That's how big the change was.
Your mother changed. Your mother, yes. who all
before she died, she changed remarkably. And so, out of curiosity, I had to meet, out of like that journalistic, I had to meet this woman that had changed my mother, because it was like, what did she do? Like drug her? What happened? It was so remarkable, the change. So, but that narrative arc in the TED Talk is like, here I met Carla Faye Tucker. And then I basically had the same change happen to me. Right. So, and I said to the woman that invited me, and apparently, it's like, I wasn't as bad as, my mom is, because I was actually helping her write her book and typing as she was talking. And she said, every time I have trouble with, whenever I don't know what to do, say, or pray with somebody that I'm working with, and this is a woman in full-time ministry, I take them to prison. And I looked back looked at her and I wait, you invited me to prison. And I go, I wasn't that bad. And she looked at me and she said, yeah, you were. So meeting Carla Faye Tucker was, I learned a lot of life lessons. And, I had left my faith. Like I didn't believe in God. I was so angry. And of course I didn't know how angry I was at both my mother and my father, the situation, why me? Because everything was basically, the rug was everything I stood on, my family, the reputation, everything was gone. Right. So who was I? And so if you have nothing to hang your hat on, that's what makes prison such a remarkable place, is because the worst thing about everyone that's there. And the thing about grace is that even though the worst thing about that person, you're still loved. And so this whole storytelling arc and the whole, what I've made a living doing is making sure that people are heard and seen. And after being heard and seen, still loved. There's nothing that, you can tell me, there's nothing that, this woman that brought me to prison, nothing that you could tell her that would shock her, that would make her feel anything less about you. And when you bump up against that type of unconditional love, it's life-changing.
Powerful stuff. Well, we are going to pivot over to the final word of advice with Diana Keough in just a moment. Her talk is called The Power of Personal Story. We're going to have a link to that. You've got to watch this talk. It's incredible. So many twists, so many surprises, and in the end, redemption, really. It's a powerful talk. Go to our show notes page, BeTheTalk.com. We will have a link to The Power of Personal Story, Diana's talk in there, and we will also have Diana's LinkedIn website right there, and we'll have a link so that you can find out more about what Diana is up to. And we're going to pivot back over to Diana for the final word of advice. Hey, Talk Universe, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you want to give the talk to change the world, but you don't know how or even where to start, no problem at all. Go to BeTheTalk.com/get accepted for my new 5-day email course that'll show you how. Absolutely free. Just go to BeTheTalk.com/get accepted.
Oh gosh. On word of advice on putting a TED Talk together, or word of advice about getting out of bed in the morning each day?
Oh, whichever. Pick one.
I think the best TED Talks, and again, it's if you start studying the structure of story, and the structure of personal story, there's always got to be a so what, and that so what is the redemptive part, and really the application on how is this applied to everybody that doesn't need to know about this. And as a storyteller, the way that I've always structured story is to make you care about something you wouldn't normally care about. If you don't have any diabetes in the family, I needed to have you care about the person that I was writing about. And that's what every TED Talk, when you're structuring it, it's got to be the so what, and how do I make anybody care about this? It can't be necessarily about you, which sounds counterintuitive, but it really is on basically setting up the story. So there's redemption, and the so what is very clear.
Diana Keough, thank you for coming on the talk today and sharing your wisdom with Talk Universe.
Thank you for having me, Nathan. It was great meeting you.
Thanks for listening to Be the Talk. For tips and resources to help you change the world, go to BeTheTalk.com. See you tomorrow.